Rise up, come on and rise up. Rise up, come on and rise up.
Spreading across 50 countries in just 1 year, Extinction Rebellion, XR, wants the world to see climate change as an existential crisis. Here in Brooklyn, they're doing whatever it takes to wake up their fellow New Yorkers.
Rising with the mountaintop, flowing with the ocean.
How do you find yourself dressed as an airplane on a 90-degree day in Prospect Park?
With sea levels rising, how does the city prepare for the next flood? In Lower Manhattan, with a huge project called the Big U.
HUD ordered each of the projects different amounts, and the Big U got $335 million.
But the course of true self-protection never did run smooth.
They came back with an entirely different design, and everybody went crazy.
Meanwhile, it's going to get hotter, especially in inland neighborhoods like Bushwick.
There's just concrete sort of everywhere, and so it all is just like bouncing at you.
Will the city's strategies help keep us cooler and drier? This week, facing down the threat of heat and high water. Today, I'm getting a lesson in civil disobedience from the folks at the Park Slope chapter of Extinction Rebellion.
Hey, climate emergency. Learn about the climate emergency. Climate emergency.
This brand new chapter of XR is hoping to join the fight with a good old-fashioned protest.
We're running out of time, let the corporations burn.
We're stopping traffic.
XR makes the news by making us pay attention to climate change, using everything from die-ins to stopping traffic and performance art, even dancing naked in the UK's House of Commons.
The group undertook their first action in London, where they were founded, on Halloween weekend of 2018, where they went to Parliament Square and declared their rebellion against the government of the United Kingdom. In December of that very same year, the group undertook their first meeting in New York City. And now, on this summer day, the Park Slope chapter of Extinction Rebellion has taken to the park to let people know they're here. How do you find yourself dressed as an airplane on a 90-degree day in Prospect Park?
Well, it does create some shade, so that's good. I joined the Extinction Rebellion local chapter. I live nearby, and we did an art build on Monday to make kind of symbols of some of the more egregious CO2 emitters, which airplanes are one of them. And so I found out I had a talent for building planes out of garbage.
So this is all spectacle, but there's something very serious behind it.
Yeah, so we're really trying to galvanize support of the local community and join what is an international movement, but which is a very local problem. Climate change has affected New Yorkers. I live in Gowanus, and I was here during Hurricane Sandy. We see a lot of flooding. We see a lot of problems with the air quality. We see the hottest record temperature just last month. So I think that raising more awareness of this and getting more people in the community involved will help our politicians make good on their promise to take action on climate emergency.
Since the 1970s, more people in America have died because of heat-related illnesses than any other natural disasters. In fact, the number of people who died because of heat waves is greater than the sum total of all other natural hazards put together.
So what
distinguishes whether a particular neighborhood is likely to be colder or hotter than the average? What are the factors?
So the first thing is how tightly and closely the buildings are packed. If there is more space between the buildings in general, then you could expect the neighborhood to be a little bit less hotter. And also the amount of green space, like trees, will really dictate. If you have a lot of shadows covering the streets, then you can expect to have a cooler place.
Using computer modeling, Pratap Mamramurthy studies the impact of heat, water vapor, and pollutants on the urban climate. He says this summer, his own hometown of Chennai, India, suffered a month straight of 120-degree days. No New York City neighborhood is that hot, but scientists and advocates say some are hotter than others.
The New York City Department of Health did a citywide study to see what communities are most heat vulnerable using a variety of indicators, including things like income, including things like urban canopy coverage, and Bushwick is at the top of the list on being one of the most heat vulnerable communities.
There's not a lot of shade. There's just concrete sort of everywhere, and so it all is just like bouncing at you, and yeah, it's impossible to escape.
So the risks of heat vary by neighborhood and also by time of day.
So we're in the daytime now, and obviously this is traditionally when we think of it as hottest, but a lot of the risks associated with extreme heat are really about nighttime, right?
So true. So that's what happens is, like, during the daytime you have a lot of the sunlight, and then our buildings absorb this radiation and keeps this in. So in the nighttime, even when the outside cools down, inside the buildings they don't really cool down. So for example, people experience heat wave like conditions indoor even 2 to 3 days after the heat wave ends.
Along with the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination and the Office of Sustainability, the Office of Resiliency has been charged with helping New York City cope with the climate crisis. It's headed by Janie Bavishi.
Like, how is the threat of extreme heat different from the other stuff you think about for climate change?
One of the phenomenons that we deal with extreme heat is the urban heat island effect, which means that cities tend to be hotter than rural areas or surrounding areas, up to 22 degrees hotter, actually.
22 degrees?
22 degrees hotter. And it's because of our density, the dark impervious surfaces that we have all over the city, like roads and black tar roofs, and limited vegetation. And so cities tend to be hotter.
Last week, I guess, when we had the huge heat wave, nearly 50,000 people went out of power in Brooklyn alone, which is a huge risk. New York is a pretty big city, but it has very varying landscapes. There is a lot of intra-urban variability for New York City.
Heat is dangerous, and that danger is magnified by social factors across the New York City map.
We've identified which neighborhoods are the most vulnerable to extreme heat by creating a heat vulnerability index that takes into account both those physical factors, but also social factors. Incidents of poverty or lack of social cohesion are things that can make a neighborhood more vulnerable to extreme heat.
Older people, people with chronic illnesses are more at risk?
Yes, the heat impacts disproportionately older adults, people with chronic illnesses, and low-income communities as well.
That reality is starting to change who is seen as an environmental advocate.
I think there is a perception that the environmental movement is for white people and people who are privileged and don't have to worry about things about, how am I going to put food on the table, like, can I get a job, like basic, fulfilling basic needs. And I think once people realize that, they're like, oh yeah, like, the reason why I have these health issues is because I live next to a highway, and that's because of redlining, and now this is becoming worse because of climate change, and it's all interrelated.
During extreme heat weather events, there's an intense increase in energy consumption. And when that happens, the city turns on their peaker plants, which often tend to be the most polluting plants in the city, and they are all located in environmental justice communities. So it's just exacerbating the issue of air quality, which is worsened by extreme heat, and it just has a compounding effect.
Peaker plants are power plants that generally run only when there is a high demand, known as peak demand for electricity. That demand, of course, comes chiefly from air conditioning.
The stats show that like 86% of New York City households have some form of air conditioning, but we can see on this street here that in a lot of cases that just means what looks like a single window unit for an apartment, right?
Exactly, yeah, and they might not be even good enough to cool a room. Or maybe in most cases they're probably able to cool a small bedroom, but people are not sleeping in their bed all day long.
Hopefully not,
general.
yeah. And we're walking by one now, you can feel the heat coming out. The air conditioner it's not like neutralizing the heat, right? It's just displacing it.
It's just displacing it, exactly. And there is a lot of energy involved in also doing the displacement in general. And overall what happens is like a lot of this heat, and in a city like New York with 8 million people, is pretty big enough that it can actually impact the local environmental conditions.
Here's something you may not know. The city's official advice during the next heat wave is to keep your AC at 78. It may not feel all that cool, but it reduces the burden on the electrical grid while still keeping you safe in your home.
Air conditioning is really important as a way to cool off from extreme heat. But if you don't have air conditioning, then it's really important to find access to a cool space.
And people can do that how?
During heat waves, the city sets up cooling centers all over the city. Getting yourself to a cooling center is really important.
They don't have a very robust process to manage these cooling centers. It's more of an ad hoc system, right, where libraries or senior centers are activated to become cooling centers. But my organization has been actually calling a lot of these places to see what's going on. Some places don't know that they're a cooling center, some places are not open, some places don't have AC working or don't have water available, right? Also, the location of these cooling centers, which they don't release until the beginning of a heat wave.
Can New York City do even more to help soften the impact of the climate crisis?
So among a lot of other urban areas, I think particularly in the United States, New York City kind of leads a lot of these initiatives. There's a lot of initiatives to combat heat.
Among them are pilot programs like Be a Buddy, which enlists volunteers to check in on elderly people and make sure they have access to air conditioning and stay hydrated. And home health aides are being trained to detect early signs of heat-related illness. It's all part of Cool Neighborhoods, a $106 million initiative the city launched in 2017.
There is a project called Cool Roof Project where a lot of the roofs were painted with reflective painting so that they will reflect most of the incoming solar radiation out into the space so they don't get absorbed in the urban areas.
And when we do it in clusters in a particular neighborhood, it can also have a cooling effect across the neighborhood and bring down the ambient temperatures. So we've already coated 10 million square feet of rooftops across the city, and our goal is to continue to coat at least 1 million square feet every year for the next several years.
Cool Roofs is free for affordable housing developments, nonprofits, and houses of worship. But even supporters of these programs are aware of their limitations.
For example, the Cool Roof program will only work if you have very 1 or 2 story houses with a lot of roof exposed to the sunlight. However, in New York, you do have a lot of tall buildings where mostly it's the walls and so on that are exposed, whereas the roof has very little to do with it. So that's an issue.
Cool roofs, is a low-hanging fruit strategy. I think it is something that we can do, but the best way to deal with it is all about nature-based infrastructure. So having more street trees in a community like Bushwick, having more bioswales, having more community gardens, having adequate parks that are not just cement, parks that have a lot of nature incorporated into them.
Given how important green space is, do we have enough of it? Is there a process for creating more of it? How do we make the city more green to fight off the effects of extreme heat?
As part of the Cool Neighborhoods program, we're also planting street trees in the most heat vulnerable neighborhoods. And by the way, those are the South Bronx, Northern Manhattan, and Central Brooklyn. So we're targeting those neighborhoods first to plant street trees, increase vegetation, increase that greenery that can help bring ambient temperatures down in those neighborhoods.
I think the city is not adequately giving the value to street trees and all of the benefits that it provides. Like a street tree is providing urban heat island mitigation, it's providing air quality benefits, it's creating new spaces in the community, and they're not valuing all of those things. They're just looking at the cost of what it takes to build that.
Extreme heat is deadly, and it poses a different climate change threat than coastal storms. You can't build a seawall against it, you can't just move to higher ground. And New York is going to have to deal with extreme heat, most likely as soon as next summer.
I've described the project as a passive aggressive direct action performance cardio campaign. But I've been doing this project since February. I go to the Prospect Park YMCA, where the New York City mayor also exercises performatively. These are just a few of the shirts that I have made. So this is the one that I mentioned is the first original shirt, which is says public education matters, #fund CUNY. Asked him about the city budget and asked him about if there was any news about CUNY funding in there. He was just sort of like no comment and shut down that conversation. So after that, I was kind of thinking that it's just bullshit that he's there and that I'm a public employee, and like if I try to talk to him about anything related to policy, he's just like not there for it. This is the one that I've definitely gotten the most response from, which is the "Don't Run for President, Fix New York City First." And this is when I started putting the hashtag. Initially I wasn't, and I realized that the mayor might not know that the shorts were like specifically for him. You know, I'll tweet at him and hopefully get on a treadmill in front of him while he does his stretching. I'm also very careful only to make t-shirts about policy issues that he can actually take action on. So he declared that New York City has a climate emergency, and so this shirt demands he takes action on that. It seems like a clear way to deliver a message without carrying a protest sign or doing something that would be interpreted as like disruptive in a way that would get me removed from the YMCA. He definitely notices me, like his security guards definitely notice me. Like whether or not it affects his policy decisions is, I don't think it will. It definitely makes me feel like I have like a small voice. That's the thing that's really frustrating about, I think, the political reality that we're living in, is that politicians do understand the threat of climate change, but no one is willing to like put their own neck on the line and do something drastic. The Symbolic climate emergency declaration is just like a symbolic thing. I think he did it in part to advance his own profile because of his presidential bid. The city has done nothing that I have seen. I mean, they keep developing more areas into high density residential areas along waterfronts that are polluted, that are below sea level, that are at risk of storm surge. You know, there's still people who are not fully recovered from Hurricane Sandy. I mean, I know that like projected flooding for just this part of Brooklyn makes me like wonder, like, should we like stay in this apartment? Like, you know, I have questions about like the long-term sustainability of like this community. And I don't think that city policy reflects that at all.
After Hurricane Katrina, I think the entire United States was really surprised and could not believe what happened. And then when Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast United States, I think that was a real turning point in realizing that our communities need to be built differently, and we need to start building stronger.
So where we are now is the highest point of the park. And so from here, as the park slopes towards the west and towards the south and east, it starts to get lower and lower and lower till it's really in the floodplain. When Sandy happened, maybe about 15% of this park was flooded. And Star White House has been working in this park for 22 years, and we're very familiar with the park, its history, its use, and its topography. And so, you know, this became one of the many areas we focused on when we were first asked to get involved in the response to Hurricane Sandy effort.
Today we announce a plan unlike anything that has been done before in terms of its scope, in terms of its impact. This is a plan that will protect Lower Manhattan for the remainder of this century, all the way to 2100 and, in fact, beyond.
The Mayor's Office of Resiliency is responsible for preparing the city for the unprecedented challenge of climate change, and we're doing that in multiple ways. In Lower Manhattan, we have several major initiatives underway. One is the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which is a 2.5-mile project that runs from Montgomery Street up to East 25th Street. And then another major initiative is the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Initiative, which includes 4 infrastructure projects that are in design or completed or will be moving into construction by the end of this administration to protect 70% of Lower Manhattan. And then we're also launching a master planning effort to extend the shoreline of the seaport and the financial district to protect the other 30% of Lower Manhattan. The original concept for these projects actually came from a proposal known as the Big U, which was developed by an independent design firm called the BRIC Ingalls Group. They submitted the concept to respond to the Rebuild by Design competition.
Rebuild by by Design begun after Hurricane Sandy as an initiative of HUD, which is the federal government, and President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Task Force. And the initial idea was that Rebuild by Design would be a collaborative way that communities can get together with local governments and designers in a competition form to address the vulnerabilities that were exposed during Hurricane Sandy.
If over time we want to create this kind of higher ground along here, it's actually very complicated to figure out how do you keep out the sea while enabling this easy flow of people to enjoy the largest green space down here.
Architects and engineers and landscape architectures and scientists and academics and community specialists would come together, form teams, and compete. 148 applied and 10 were chosen.
We were invited onto the team with the Bjarke Ingels group with BIG to be part of their team. And the first part of the competition was to do research on different areas that had flooded all the way from southern New Jersey to Connecticut. Quickly, Lower Manhattan became the mission of the big team, and then BIG, who is so fantastic at branding, came up with the Big U to call this 10-mile U-shaped line of vulnerable areas around the shoreline of Lower Manhattan.
So each team then started working with specific local communities in that geography to further create what we call design opportunities.
Personally, I've been involved with resiliency for Community Borough 3 for almost 7 years, going back actually before Sandy and after.
All right, everyone, we're going to start tonight's meeting. Welcome to our Parks, Recreation, Waterfront and Resilience Committee. A
lot of the work we do is to take the input from the community and sort of formulate resolutions based on the information we get. Since Sandy, we've been tasked with handling a variety of resiliency projects, including the ESCR.
BIG has this huge model making operation. So we had this idea of taking the design studio to the community.
Designers and other folks would come with preliminary designs, ask the community a bunch of questions. Then they would come back again and present how they sort of took that feedback and put it into the plan, and then ask even more questions.
We ended up with a system of what we call integrated flood protection all along the waterfront, taking each segment and each neighborhood on its own terms.
Even if it was like, we need to put the bike lane here, or we need to raise the berm over here, or this is the kind of programming we'd like to have, people saw that in the designs.
After the competition, HUD awarded each of the projects different amounts, from 10 million to 335 million. And the Big U got 335 million.
Oh, well, what happened next was the city took the money and they put out a request for proposals to implement it, but they put the request for proposals out to one of the city agencies' on-call engineering teams, which we were not on one of. So then now other people are working on the implementation. To have this much knowledge and to have spent this much time working on something and to sort of be, as Big calls me, the midwife of the Big U, to have that role and then to be, not able to work on it is, it's a shame.
I think it's important to realize that the Big U was a concept. The Big U inspired the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. The city has moved forward with planning and engineering analysis for that project. So this plan that we're presenting now takes that conversation forward and proposes projects that we can actually implement.
We'd really gotten really far with finally working in partnership with some of the city agencies and other folks, seeing real dollars put behind our ideas until the project was about to go into the city's uniform land use review process. They were just about to start that process when everything stopped and everything went quiet until September. And in September, they came back with an entirely different design. And everybody went crazy.
We're going to keep this brief. We actually may get out of here about 8:30, which is a first for about a year.
The city and the community collaborated for about 5 years on a plan, a resiliency plan, that would be really effective, that would really keep the neighborhood safe. But then abruptly, with no warning, it was set aside and a new plan was put in place that calls for the complete closure of almost 3 miles of coastline and parkland. So all of that space will suddenly be unavailable. They're saying for 3.5 years, but I think you heard tonight that we're afraid it's going to be more like 6, 7, 10.
We have a very torn apart community behind this new design. They feel that the trees are going to be killed, species are going to be killed.
We want to make sure that the community has a chance to shape exactly what that looks like and also provide input on what other benefits they would like to see as part of these projects. Eastside Coastal Resiliency is a great example of this. Not only will the community get the flood protection that they really need, but also they'll have improved waterfront access. We're rebuilding several of the pedestrian bridges that go over the FDR into the East River Park, and they'll have a new park.
I think people need to examine, okay, the city did flip the plan, but is it actually a better plan? And I think we've gotten to a point now where we still have problems with the way the city handled this, but we've looked at the plan and we've looked at the benefits of the plan and said that with some mitigations and some concessions that it may actually be a better plan for the community.
So we were told a bunch of different reasons why it needed to be changed. The problem was that we were told after. We weren't consulted, we weren't included, and people felt very disrespected.
We want them to listen to us about how important that open space is for us, particularly for our seniors and our kids, and work together with us to come up with a modification of this plan that looks out for those people, rather than just shoving this plan down our throats.
I live right across the street from the highway in the East River, and I saw the water come in and we were traumatized. So I know that there's no option for me that includes no flood protection. Like, I cannot live with leave the park alone and don't do anything. I can't live through that again.
Just a few stories about heat and high water. Standing here on this autumn afternoon, it's easy to forget that we just survived the hottest summer on record. And whether it's heat in Bushwick or the issues facing our built environment as we look toward resiliency, we'll continue to introduce you to activists and innovators who are on the front lines in this struggle to make a more sustainable planet. Thanks for joining us. And please make sure to continue to come back or look back at past episodes of the show at our home on the web at youtube.com/BRIC TV. We'll see you next time. Bye now.